Whatever else you want to say about the events of this weekend, following the state of emergency declared on Friday, and the Premier and Prime Minister again asking politely for order to be restored in Ottawa, and at the all-important border crossing in Windsor, one thing is clear. Something in our country is seriously off-kilter. With us now on what's needed to nudge things back on track, in the nation's capital, Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at Carleton University. In the annex of the provincial capital, Janice Stein, Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and Founding Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T. And in Leaside, in the provincial capital, Matt Gurney, columnist for the National Post, The Line, and a contributor to our website, tvo.org as well. And it's great to have all of you with us here at TVO, and let's just fess up right off the top. If people are watching us at 8 o'clock at night, we have taped this earlier. So events may have passed us by, and we want to put that on the record right now because our sense of where things are at right now is that, of course, in Ottawa over the weekend, the counter-protest did grow. There was an attempt to block an intersection, prevent vehicles from joining the downtown convoy. The Ambassador Bridge in Windsor is now clear. Ontario, as we know, last week declared a state of emergency, and Bill Blair, the federal emergency management and preparedness minister, said the feds are prepared to use the Federal Emergencies Act. The situation clearly is not yet under control. He said enforcement needs to take place. Police have an important job to do, and our expectation is that they will do it. All right, let's just I want to start by getting a sense from all three of you as to just where is this province at right now? Janice, start us off. Where are we at?
I'm going to say something, Steve, that may not be very popular. But what we are seeing is a real example of innovation. And that's why it's so hard to respond to. A group figured out how you weaponize large trucks and use that to shut down an entire neighborhood in Ottawa and shut down a bridge. You know how innovative this is. So because Canada is now at the leading cycle of innovation around the world, in Paris, in Brussels, we will see it in the United States as well. We are exporting this innovation to the rest of the world. But we need to give everybody just a little break here because they are having to adapt in real time to a new way of doing demonstration and protest.
Okay, Stephanie, you are there. Where's it at for you right now?
I actually very much, it may not be popular, but I actually very much agree with Professor Stein that this is absolutely something that is innovative and we've never really seen before. The idea that people could just use heavy equipment, trucks, vehicles, human bodies, families with children in all together and just simply blockade a downtown and key economic checkpoints. I mean, we haven't really seen that before. And I agree, this is something that is outside the norm. The people of Ottawa, however, are tired. We saw that, as you mentioned, in the counter demonstration this week. It was a fairly spontaneous I don't want to say uprising because, we are talking about a city of bureaucrats. But the fact is that, if you can get the most boring city on earth in the most boring country on earth sometimes to actually stand up to a bunch of people like this, that that tensions are reaching something of a boiling point.
Matt, where are things right now?
I'm going to agree with everything I've heard so far, but I'm going to add two qualifiers. The first is, even though this was innovative, we were warned. There were statements put out by some of the organizers of this movement before they arrived in Ottawa that they were going to do basically exactly what they intended to do. So it was innovative, but the innovation was telegraphed. Also, I agree overall with Janice, but I would also just say I was prepared to cut leadership there a bit of a break too. Not well into the third week kind of a break, though. Like, this is innovative, but we as citizens, we as a democracy, and they as government officials who are supposed to be the grown-ups here, need to be able to show some ability to adapt. And I think what we've seen I think probably for the first week or so, as best I could tell, there was a degree of, we could almost call it leadership paralysis, as they were trying to just sort of understood what had happened. Takes time for those briefings to circulate their way through. I think we're mostly out of the shock phase, and now we're into the confused, what do we do about it phase. So I will give them a bit of a break, but I think my break ended after the first week that Ottawa was occupied.
Janice, we know it is a tried, tested, and true Canadian tradition for different levels of government to blame each other, for different institutions and services to blame each other. But we are really seeing that taken to the nth degree right now. What should we infer from the fact that the feds say it's Ottawa Police's job, that the Ottawa Police say we need help from the province or else we can't do our jobs, from the municipality to anyway, you see what's going on here, and it's on and on and on. What do we make of that?
You sure do see what's going on here, Steve. That was some testy press conference, unprecedented really, by Bill Blair. And by the way, just as an aside, for everybody who last year was calling for defunding the police. We don't hear that right now. We're, in fact, in front of a demand for greater police resources. But what you're seeing writ large is the pathology of the Canadian Federation. You can't have lived through the pandemic these last 2 years without getting a much deeper appreciation of how fractured our decision-making is, even in a crisis, across federal, provincial, and municipal boundaries. It literally drives you to distraction. I think Matt's right. It took almost 10 days to 2 weeks to gear up that federal provincial discussion. Some of the stuff that went on between the federal government and the Ontario government and the Ottawa Police, if you read about this in a book, you'd think that the author was making it up. It is dysfunctional to the extreme. And boy, I sure hope when we come out of this pandemic, which we will at some point, we take a look at how we stand up decision-making procedures in real time to confront novel problems. The virus was a novel problem. This is a novel problem. It can't be business as usual at the pace of business as usual in our fractured system of decision making. It's just not fit for purpose anymore. That's the truth.
I guess the trick, though, Stephanie, what makes this tricky is the fact that, everybody's sort of telling a little bit of the truth here. It is true. The Prime Minister can't simply order the police to go in there and knock heads around, right? And the Premier can't do that either. He's not permitted to. And on the other hand, anyway, and on we go. So again, you being in the middle of all of this, how do you regard all this sort of buck passing from each level of administration?
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree with Janice just a bit when she says no one's calling for defunding the police. I actually think the confidence in the police has just been absolutely devastated by this. And one of the things that I'm going to be looking for is in the next couple of months is just the conversation we have about policing. I'm hearing from people in government, people, in the city, people, in the national security services who are all thinking, geez, this just simply isn't working anymore. And we need to the modeling of policing we have and what we're talking about in a year is going to be a really interesting point. With regards to this, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of discussion about, policing options responses, but there were some immediate responses that just simply haven't been used. And I've never really understood why. It wasn't until Friday last week where we heard the Premier say, individuals, they could face fines of $100,000. They could be arrested and sentenced to a year in prison. But, we have some fairly basic tools that don't require, multi-level of government coordination. Just basic administrative law. The Premier might not be able to direct the police, but the government actually has the power to administer driver's licenses, commercial licenses, and these can all be, taken away, suspended. And, let's face it, yeah, these are a bunch of people who are frustrated, alienated. I do think, again, we need to figure out ways to talk to people who think that the best way to get their point across at this point is taking over a bridge, that's responsible for a large fraction of our trade. But at the end of the day, there's just so many other tools that just haven't been used that don't require a kinetic response. These people, if you're driving a $75,000 truck or a $300,000 truck, you have an incentive to not get fines and to keep your license, right? Because this is probably going to be your livelihood. I think this is just a really important point that we're seeing, that we can actually do things that don't require a lot of federal provincial coordination. Why we haven't seen that, I don't know, and that's a question I would definitely want to put to the provincial authorities.
Well, just on that one, it was fascinating because that request went to the provincial government. It was referred to Carolyn Mulroney, who wrote back, oh my, that's not our process. We have to issue 2 warning tickets. That's what the system says. And these drivers have not been adequately warned. So it's going to take time for us to follow our process. That's the answer that came back. It wasn't that the suggestion wasn't made. It was, but that was the answer.
But Matt, we're under a
they could have started writing letters. We could have been on this a week ago. If you're not receiving letters or warnings because you're sitting on a bridge, that's not the province's fault. Again, this is something that could have been just done. And sorry, the last point I wanted to raise, Steve, that you said is, the government leaders can't direct police. No, but they can set expectations. Right. Mm-hmm. They can set priorities, they can set, directions. And this is what the province needs to communicate. This kind of, I can't do anything. This is just simply out of all the realms of my possibility is wrong. It's just absolutely wrong. So, yeah, no, we need, there's been a lot of buck passing. And I think this is why you're now seeing the bureaucrats of Ottawa rise in unity, which again is just kind of unprecedented in my time being here.
But Matt, if the province of Ontario passes a state of emergency, which they have, presumably that empowers everybody who needs empowering to do all of the things that the other 2 guests have just mentioned.
Well, yeah, presumably, but I'm going to pick up Stephanie's point there and run with it a bit because I think she's right here. We can talk about the failure to coordinate among multiple levels of government. We can and we should and we will. But we also need to accept the fact that within the kind of the 3 spheres of government here, none of them have maxed out their own capacities here. None of them have done everything reasonable, even within their own jurisdictions on their own here. If the city of Ottawa as a municipality or the province of Ontario or even the federal government, whose powers are more limited here, had sort of gone all out and then it had failed, that is more when we start going, okay, well, how do we kind of bring all our powers together here or pass emergency legislation? Up until maybe the end of last week, I don't even think we were doing within the limited spheres of influence they each have the maximum possible. To your point, though, with the emergency legislation and also with the court injunction that was brought down to sort of to enable the activity at the Ambassador Bridge here, as one of my friends, a lawyer, had said to me privately, and I totally ripped it off and tweeted out his joke without crediting him for it. He just said to me, I'm skeptical about this idea that we have to have the courts order the police to enforce the law. That should actually be what they do. And there are procedural and frankly butt covering reasons that often they would want to have an injunction here. Yeah. But I think part of what we've been seeing here is not a lack of ability, not a lack of legislation or procedural powers. It's just a lack of willingness.
Well, let me get you to follow up on that in this regard, Matt. There are a whole bunch of disparate elements that represent the people who have done what they've done in the nation's capital. There is a small handful of people who are, quote unquote, the organizers. And then, I always like former Premier David Peterson's line, and then there are others for whom the devil decided to host a party and invite all his friends. Given that you've been there and you've talked to a lot of the people on the ground, lay out for us all the disparate elements that are there and why this has therefore been so hard to kind of negotiate with anybody to bring to an end.
Well, I mean, I think, Steve, it's even more complicated than you just laid out, right? Because we're talking about the situation in Ottawa, and I can talk a little bit about that. But I think as well, we also have to recognize that there was a situation in Windsor. There is a situation in Emerson, Manitoba, and now in Surrey, British Columbia, and Coutts, Alberta. So this is very complicated. Even within the protests, specifically in Ottawa, though, I spent a couple of days there, kind of wandering around, just eyeballing it and talking to people. And I described it in some of the reports I wrote as reminding me of Occupy Toronto in my hometown all those many years ago now, where especially early on, it's a bit of a party atmosphere. There's a lot of positive feeling, people coming together. They're meeting like-minded people. They're there to enforce change. But after a couple of days, other elements start to arrive. And one of the things I had written about in the Ottawa protest was that the protest right around Parliament had become sort of a magnet for the city's mentally ill and homeless population. So that changes the dynamic of the crowd. You have people arriving who are perhaps misinformed, but they're sincere. Like they are angry and frustrated and confused by public health measures. And then I'm talking to other people who were there explicitly talking about, oh, and we must overthrow the globalist communist conspiracy that is mind controlling the prime minister. And I don't know if that person is mentally ill or has just gone completely through the looking glass here. There are, according to sources I've spoken with, this protest, even if it began organically, even if we set aside the possible manipulation of social media to sort of whip this thing up, even if it did begin organically as Canadians who are frustrated and angry, that there has been a drawing in of other sort of more professional protesting types who have now sort of become part of the crowd. They're either in the crowd or they're in some of the satellite sites here. Steve, you've already made the point. We're taping this before this will air, so God only knows what the next few hours will bring. It's worth noting that late yesterday, there was apparently a deal between the Ottawa municipal government and some of the protest leaders until there wasn't. So just in terms of who you're talking to and who you're negotiating with, this is a really complicated one. And I think that I do have sympathy for both police and political leaders there. You can't pick up the phone, call someone and say, all right, let's cut a deal.
Right. Janice, I wonder, in terms of public policy making, whether it was wise, in your view, for the Prime Minister to take the military option off the table right away.
Yeah, I definitely think it was, Steve. And to go to Matt's point here, and that's a wonderful description of the multiple mixes that were on the street. They were on the street in Toronto, and I had a chance to spend a little time too. And Matt, what you're saying absolutely reflects the kind of experience. So we know, looking back, that recourse to military instruments to deal with a crowd of people that pose a threat to public safety. That's fundamentally what we're dealing with, as well as the problems on the bridges and the borders. At the moment, it seems so attractive because it's going to solve the problem. It's the after effect that are really terrible, and the excessive costs that we pay for doing that. I think there are many, many steps even today before the military. One, as we've all said, the authorities have to use the tools in their toolkit to capacity. Secondly, there has to be cross-jurisdictional correspondence. But if you actually watch the drama on the Windsor Bridge this weekend, it was better than I knew, really. You saw the police in tremendous discipline slowly walk crowds back until they were able to clear the bridge. So that's what I mean. It needs discipline. It needs patience. And we are dealing, in fact, and this is the big challenge, with a large groups of people who are there for different reasons. Some, frankly, told me they were there because they lost their jobs as a result of vaccine mandates. That's an entirely different group from the people who commandeered these rigs, set up elaborate communications infrastructure, are so skilled, are so disciplined. And we need the same kind of discipline in response. No way the military, in 4 words.
Well, okay, this is not an original point here, Stephanie, but the current Prime Minister's father, 51 years ago, faced a similar set of circumstances when a group that, they didn't know who the leaders particularly were, kidnapped somebody, try to take over a city, try to take over a province. And the military was called in, and they cleaned it up pretty lickety-split, and the FLQ disappeared. Now, some people are going to say, it worked then, why not try it today?
So I think there's a number of important historical differences. I agree completely that, calling in the military at this stage would be a wrong thing to do. In the second week of this, I actually watched the first time the police went into the Coventry Road kind of supply station. Matt, I know, actually tried to visit there and was politely received and told to leave, if I understand your article correctly, Matt. But the police went in, didn't steal. They acquired some of the supplies, and then they left. And they were in shock. They were in general shock just at the reaction of general policing, right? They were instantly making excuses on their live stream saying, oh, the police didn't want to do this, that they, had shame on their faces and things like this. But, to the point that just basic policing seems to deter a large number, maybe not everyone, but a large number of these protesters. Whether that will work for all situations because there's now multiple supply camps around the city, I'm not sure. But I mean, I think this is part of the frustration that, basic administrative law, basic slow policing could really help make a difference, but we just haven't seen those efforts. So then when we talk about the War Measures Act, which actually doesn't exist anymore, we replaced it in 1988 with the Emergencies Act because the War Measures Act was seen as so draconian then and would certainly be now as well. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The provinces all have Emergencies Acts already in place for the COVID situation. It doesn't make it clear to me which powers would actually be invoked by this. I mean, the provinces can request whatever kind of federal assistance they want under their own legislation. To me, it would be symbolic. And calling in the military in this particular case, I think would be the military is not meant for domestic crowd control policing. Like, they're not trained on that. It's not clear what they could really do. Maybe they could use some of their equipment in aid to the civilian power with regards to towing things. If you can't get tow trucks to tow things.
Stephanie, can I just jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
The military has been called in for snow removal in Toronto. The military has been called in to help long-term care home residents in the middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic. So the notion of what military is tasked to do these days, you'll acknowledge, is somewhat stretched from its traditional role.
Oh, absolutely. And this is there's so many conversations that we've been kind of putting aside that this crisis is really bringing to the fold. I mean, I would actually question why we needed to bring in military in order to support our long-term care homes. Do we need some kind of civilian reserve force that can actually be doing this? So we're not always actually bringing in our military. There's been people who have been arguing this for a very long time, that we might not actually need to rethink our entire emergency response in numerous levels. So we're not actually putting these demands on the military, which I think is really important for the future. But if I can just get back to your original question, the analogy, the War Measures Act was invoked when you had a small terrorist movement, right? I mean, the FLQ had some popular support, but when it started engaging in these tactics, it started losing support very quickly. It was a very small identifiable threat. And, I think there was kind of a lot of support for that, possibly some of that being hindsight. Right. I think people in Quebec may have felt differently about it at the time. It was certainly a risky thing to do. I just think that, speaking to the different groups in this protest that I think Matt has aptly described in this conversation, there's going to be those who are going to use this as propaganda. So I don't think the military is the right tool. I don't think it would really benefit the situation. And I think in absence of the government actually using all the tools at its disposal, whether municipal, provincial, or federal, as I think we all kind of agree on in this conversation, means that the military is just not the right tool at this time. Now, again, we are recording this in the morning. I'm getting reporters asking me if the Emergencies Act is coming.
Well, apparently it is. I just got sent a text saying that the cabinet's met. The Prime Minister is going to allow for the invocation of the Emergencies Act to give provincial governments extra powers to deal with all of this, and the feds as well, but no military will be brought in. That was sort of what emerged from. But Janice, let me ask you this. Your job is to look around the world and put put what's happening in this country in some kind of international context. You do that a lot. And I wonder if one of the things that we've learned from both January 6th of last year in the United States and now in Ottawa is that a very small handful of people can actually apparently give the impression that democracies are being brought down to their knees and are incapable of making decisions. Do you think that's a takeaway from all this?
Yeah, here's the trap, Steve, for governments. It's no win, right? If you respond in a very measured way and you continuously increase the pressure, and we haven't really seen much of that, frankly, over the last 2 weeks. It's been very, very slow, as we've all said. The goal is to split apart the different groups that Matt described. And you saw it happen over the Ambassador Bridge over these last 2 days. Yes, with threats of arrest and fines, yet a lot of people just left. And then when the police line formed, more people just left. So by the time the final round happened, there was just a small handful of really committed people that were still there, and that was just easier to manage. That's got to be the strategy every time. The reason it's a no-win is if you escalate too quickly, you actually radicalize some of the people. And there's long-term consequences from that, especially in an age of social media. If you respond too slowly, you get weak and effectual government. This is a crisis of authority. The civil power is broken down. So you're looking for a very narrow sweet spot here. Ultimately, all levels of government are going to take back those streets. We're not going to be living with this. There really is not much of a threat to the civil power, if we're honest about this. The real issue was the bridge. That really got people going in Ottawa last week. That one's resolved already. In Alberta, the traffic is going. It's just one lane. That's frustrating. So let's keep a sense of perspective here and use the instruments that we have. It's just really tough on elected officials, this kind of moment. And you have to give the Prime Minister and the Cabinet credit. They did not resort in a visceral way to the strongest set of instruments that they have. I think in hindsight, Steve, just as with the FLQ crisis in Montreal, a more measured response would have been better. We'll look back at this and we'll say roughly, and I acknowledge how slow and frustrating this has been, but roughly they're in the right zone.
We got a minute left here. Let me give 30 seconds to Matt and then 30 seconds to Stephanie on the apparent paper tigerish look of some of our governments right now who seem to be incapable of doing what many people think is required in order to show that democracies can cope with situations like this. Matt, go ahead.
I'll pick up on what Janice was saying about having that kind of the Ambassador Bridge, right? The slow peeling away of the different groups, the literally slow advance of the lines of police in to kind of disperse people. You can have slow action on the ground at the tactical level, but I think you need swift and decisive action at the strategic level to get those guys doing those slow de-escalating actions a lot faster. You shouldn't wait weeks to initiate your slow action. You should have your slow action going in very quickly. Still calm, still rational, still trying to keep things under control, but you don't let it fester for weeks, because if there is a threat to the authority of the state, it's the appearance of weakness more than weakness itself.
Last 30 to Stephanie.
Yeah, it's been deeply frustrating. We are invoking the Emergencies Act, but, we have criminal statutes that can give people 10 years for just engaging in criminal mischief. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out, if this is kind of a symbolic tool by the federal government to look like it is doing something in an age when we are all kind of screaming, do something to respond. But it'll be interesting in the coming days to see how the movement itself responds to this. And, I guess what I'm going to be looking for in really the coming months is the conversations we're going to have around policing's emergencies and, how we actually respond to a threat that really doesn't seem to have a name other than subversion or possibly sedition.
Stephanie Carvin, Carleton University, Janice Stein, University of Toronto, Matt Gurney in the middle, where he finds himself from time to time on various issues, although not necessarily this time. It's great for all of you to join us tonight on TVO. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.